Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Chris.
It's good to be doing this show with you. I haven't actually done a Blogging Heads in a while, so I hope I'm not too rusty. But we are here, as we've discussed, to talk about your new book, The Body Politic, The Battle Over Science in America. I'm holding it up. I'm holding up a galley, which has Post-it notes on it. I couldn't find the final copy, although I know you guys sent me one, but this is just how I roll. I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Well, in any case, I think we should start in with a recent event, which is the Obama administration doing something incredibly surprising on Plan B emergency contraception, something that I, who am constantly tagging the political right for messing around with science, am made very upset by, because this is supposed to be my beloved pro-science administration, and here it is doing something George W. Bush would have done, in fact, basically did do.
Yeah. Well, it's something I have been thinking about in the context of your work and my own. And first of all, kudos to you for recognizing that you're a good science-minded person, and you recognize that sometimes there's an anomalous bit of data that comes up in any theory. But even before we get into Plan B, I think it's appropriate for us to recognize the loss of a colleague in letters, Christopher Hitchens,
right.
just a few hours ago. I don't know how you felt about Hitchens. We really haven't talked about it, but
he was a great hero of reason. I mean, he was a bomb-throwing figure of the Enlightenment and defender of knowledge against superstition. I mean, you can
absolutely
deeply applaud that.
And a great essayist, a real master of the King's and Queen's English. Of the land from which he departed with mixed feelings years ago for the imperial capital, Washington. And I think probably, like you, I'm a fan of the great essayists, and I think probably he and Tony Judd, whose work I don't know if you read,
not as much.
The NYU historian who died a couple of years ago. I think Judd was the only person of the last decade who came close to Hitchens as an essayist, but I would say in general Hitchens was the greatest nonfiction essayist, writer in the English language in the last few years. I used to see him on the train once in a while up to New York. He'd be usually almost always nursing a drink and looking out the window, and I assumed that he was reflecting on his next column, so I never disturbed him, but I regret that I didn't. I was a little too diffident, I guess.
No,
in any case,
it's appropriate that you do that, and I'm glad that you did. I'm glad that you stepped in.
Yeah, and our sympathies to his family, his wife and his kids, and his brother Peter, with whom he had a number of wonderful debates, with whom he disagreed on so many important matters. So, to Plan B.
Yes.
I think what's happened with regard to Plan B let's put aside, the philosophical and the conceptual problem, which we can get to in a moment. Yeah. But I think clearly what happened with regard to Plan B is, in terms of political calculation, is that the administration was worried about, another set of attack ads that would have the 11-year-old girl going into the local pharmacy, picking something up off the shelf, and the shady character outside, an older guy saying to her as she's walking out, "Did you get the stuff?" So I think they saw this as Willie Horton.
Wow.
And, they might well have been right about that from a strictly political point of view. But, I know you've been thinking about this. I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post a few days ago in which I said that science has to be protected from its friends as well as its enemies, perhaps even more so. And I think you and I certainly agree about that.
Oh, I think I called it appalling. If I didn't call it appalling, I will call it appalling now. And I said, I'm just reading from what I wrote, the supposedly pro-science and now simply hypocritical Obama administration has just provided, and then I want to say, a very, very big counterexample for someone like me to contend with, who says, and I do say, and will continue to say, there's something inherent about the right that makes it different from the left in terms of how it responds to science. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that, but it doesn't mean that you can never get weird stuff on the left, because you do. I just think that broadly they have different alignments.
I agree. The reasoning was, I think, is different. I think on the right, the cultural conservatives will be generally fine with evidence unless it bumps up against some values, some particular values and issues that they hold dear.
Yeah.
The left will always, almost always, say that they're going with the evidence, but particularly the political class will, as in this case, bow to the incendiary combination of American values that leads us in one direction and at the same time in another direction.
Yeah.
If you look at the statements, the ones that I've seen at least that the administration made, they tried to appeal to a lack of evidence.
Sure.
And that's a pretty typical, progressive line.
Well, it's a misuse of science, according to the way I defined misuses of science in my book in 2005, The Republican War on Science. It's a particular kind of what you might call playing games with uncertainty. And if I can I went back to the book because I went on and on about Plan B in the book, and I just want to read you a quote.
Yeah.
This is one of the researchers I interviewed was explaining why it's bogus to demand the particular kind of evidence that they demanded. This is back in the Bush administration. The Obama administration made up the same rationale, right? And the rationale involved, we don't know enough, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't know enough about how young adolescent girls will use this drug if it's available over the counter.
That was the argument.
That's something like that. And so there's this scientist named, I'm sorry, let me see if I can get his name right, Alistair Wood Vanderbilt at the time, and he said, he was explaining why you can't just easily get that data, which is why it's kind of, and he said, visualize the consent form for a study in which you're going to study 14 to 16-year-olds with emergency contraception specifically.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of why you can always say we don't have the data, because getting this data would be,
And if you go down to 11-year-olds, there are so few 11-year-old pregnancies that, as the biostatisticians would say, the power analysis would be ridiculous from the small. Even if you could ethically do such a study, which is, as the person you mentioned said, you can't do it under the rules. And so what do you do? Well, now I have to say I have not seen the documents that the company provided the FDA that they used to make their decision, which was overruled. But we know a heck of a lot about the reasoning processes of younger people. So you can extrapolate from what we know about the understanding of younger people, certainly people 14, 15, 16. And of course, as has also been pointed out, the requirement that the administration set up after the fact is greater than anything the FDA normally requires. So, and then of course there's the ultimate irony that this will lead to more abortions for young girls.
Sure.
And I don't think anybody can really seriously dispute that. So it is, I think, it's really appalling for people who hope that policy can be driven by evidence. But it does, I think it says more about, if their political calculus is right, and again, I think it might well be, it says more about this complicated society in which we live, perhaps, than it does about progressivism as a social movement.
I think that's fair. I mean, because of course, again, we've already said, there's no ideological reason that the Obama administration would do this. There's a very clear ideological reason why the Bush administration would do the same thing.
Right, exactly. I think that's right. So, I think we move on. I don't think we've seen the last of this. There is, for various reasons, impetus to move on. Some of it's capitalism, some of it's profit, but a lot of it is also the needs that young people have to defend themselves. So I think, on the whole, if there's not another Sumatran supervolcano or something else we do to ourselves in the next 20 or 30 years, this will finally be accepted. But the nature of our traditional values in this country, unlike Western Europe these days, is such that it happens with fits and starts.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good transition into talking about the book a little bit. There's sort of, if I could try to build your argument for you,
I'm happy to have you
comment on it. So, you first sketch science in the broad sweep of American history, painting a picture of a country that loves science and innovation in a deep sense and has for centuries. And then you go on to talk about how a new concatenation of issues that we haven't ever faced before that are only made possible by entering the new biological century. Issues springing out of, for example, neuroscience, are going to, and you say already have, created all kinds of unexpected political configurations. So sort of those two, and I guess we can start with the happy part of the story first, which is, theoretically we love science unless it's on a particular issue where we don't love it anymore, and then we make up a reason. But theoretically, we're just like a totally pro-science people.
Indeed, and very much, the other. By the way, I wish I'd used the word concatenation in my book.
Oh yeah, well,
that's a great word.
That's you have the English major turned.
Congratulations on that. Yeah.
Yes, I have others if you like.
That's good. No, send me a list. So I think we are, deeply in the DNA of the society, as the image goes these days.
Mm-hmm.
We are very much science oriented. Somebody asked me at an event a few days ago if Americans would ever get over their hype about reacting to science and technology, and I said I hope not, because that really reflects something very American. Mm-hmm. The degree of excitement that we have about new stuff, and it isn't always good. I think in the national security realm, it can be very bad, and I've heard American senior officers say that in the national security world, they fear that we're too taken with technology, and I've heard European national security experts say the same thing. As compared to the rest of the world, we overestimate what gadgets can do, but. This enthusiasm for the new is really very much part of what it is to be an American, and a lot of it has to do with what's started out as the American narrative well before the Revolution, which is the notion of John Winthrop's famous sermon, "An Errand into the Wilderness." He tried to rationalize why the Puritans were suffering as much as they were, and he did it by saying that we were basically on as John Belushi says in the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission for God. Yeah. And the need to use technology in some general way to push out into the wilderness and appropriate it, and use it to enhance the material basis for human flourishing, to improve the future, to make the future better for our kids than it has been for us, and so forth. The American dream stuff. That is so much part of what we are. And if I can step back sort of from that, but as you know, I've been involved both in the academic world and the policy world in the stem cell issue and related issues for about 10 years. And a few years ago, when I was trying to think of what book to write, I was approached by an editor from a trade publisher about writing a sort of 100-page essay on the stem cell issue. And this was when it was really at its peak. And you were very, deeply engaged.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no.
And I thought, there are people like Chris Mooney who are writing about this very well. And I don't know that I have anything particularly to add with respect to the sort of the origins of life issue. But I did start 30 years ago teaching the history of American philosophy. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try to frame what we're going through right now, that is to say, starting with stem cells and cloning and moving through the Bush administration and then the early Obama administration, put in the frame of the American narrative, which I had taught and studied intensely years ago. So that's basically what I try to do in the Body Politic. If there's anything different about it, that's what I try to bring to the discussion. Mm-hmm. And I guess, you could say that as a progressive, what I'm also trying to do is in a little bit push our friends on the other side back on their heels. Because I want to say it is much more American to take a progressive position on these issues. than is the modern conservative position.
Huh. Well, yes. Not that it's a new thing for them to completely retell the story of the American founding, to take away the whole Enlightenment bit and make it a Christian nation. They have been very, very dogged about doing that.
Right. That is definitely very much part of the worldview that they have. And one of the ironies is that so much of their view, particularly, I'm talking here, Chris, about the neoconservatives more than I am the Christian conservatives.
Okay, and I was hitting the Christian conservatives with the Christian nation thing, yeah.
Right. But the interesting is that, first of all, the neoconservatives also buy the Christian nation thing, right? They think it's important for the stability of the country to have traditional values.
Yes.
And they don't necessarily adopt those Christian values, but they think in a kind of Edmund Burkean sort of sense,
right,
that you need to have a stable value system. That that society is very fragile. Things can go terribly wrong very quickly. They think of the Holocaust. I think they're really dogged by the imagery of the Holocaust and of what they understand to be the history of eugenics and so forth. And they see it all as very frail, and they think that you need to have Christian values or some kind of traditional value system that is family-oriented and respects human individuality and so forth. Mm-hmm. And it happens to be Christian for this country. The second point about the neoconservatives, though, is that if you look, as I did in the Body Politic, in their philosophical inspirations, they tend to be basically German existentialists. Their great inspiration comes from people like Martin Heidegger, and further back, they are still exercising the analytic categories, ironically, of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, namely alienation and commodification. And this is very much a 60s combination of German philosophy and Marxist critical theory that sees capitalism as itself a problem. Even though they're neoconservatives, they actually see the technological imperative of capitalism that undermines our respect for human beings as a serious problem in the country. And they won't actually ever say that, but it's very, it's very much, I think, makes sense of some of the rhetoric that they use, and they come up to the point of being very critical of capitalism and don't quite, follow it out. So
a lot of different things are packed into the suitcase of today's Republican Party.
Well, yes, and
that's just what you make me think when you say that.
Well, that's true, and I think that's right. I mean, I think you have, on the one hand, the Tea Partiers who worry about central government, which is a very traditional American worry, but you also have these sort of elite intellectual conservatives who worry about the unbridled capitalism that could happen if the more libertarian elements of the Tea Party have their way. So it is and I think, by the way, that all this is very indirect. Some of the tensions that we're seeing in the Republican debates between, people like Ron Paul and Newt Gingrich. Newt turns out to be a big government guy, and Ron Paul obviously, makes libertarians look like they believe in taxation.
Newt is such a mystery. I mean, I can't resist doing this. We'll get back to the book, but Newt is the guy that he gives, or he did, all these speeches extolling science. He's obviously extremely intelligent, fascinated by science. Also the guy who presided over the destruction of congressional scientific expertise.
The Office of Technology
Assessment. One of the most devastating things that I think you could say happened in this country in terms of polarizing us over the nature of reality is unmooring the Congress from any objective sense of what's true and then just letting them riff and see where they get to. And, we still have the Congressional Budget Office, and I guess they'll just attack its reports. But now we don't even have the Science Office.
Well, we have the the Budget Office, there's the Congressional Research Service has somewhat stepped into that space, and the National Academy of Sciences has done a lot of work that I think the OTA would have done had they been around. I think the OTA, this is really, going into the weeds of the history, of course, that you and I are doing now, but the OTA was eliminated partly because, as I recall, it was about $22 million.
Something like that. I wrote this 5 years ago. Or more.
It was an easy place to cut, and nobody seemed to miss it. But we do miss it. I think you're right, and fortunately, it has seeded government and academia and think tanks with some really great people who continue to work in their fields and got their start at OTA. But it's a loss. It is a big loss.
Okay, so let's get back onto the trajectory of the book. So we sketched the picture of science in American history, and no big dispute about that, except maybe a little footnote that this science enthusiasm, where we always want to triumph, we always want to succeed and strive to get ahead, doesn't match that well the lack of concern with which we now approach our declining competitiveness vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That's kind of a weird. I'm not sure how you would tackle that. But maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But then we're going to go on to how the new issues in bioethics are.
Right. Look, that's a great point. Part of the problem we have right now, it reminds me of the internal improvements debate that the Congress had in the first decades of the 19th century. How involved should the federal government be in encouraging private enterprise, and particularly in investing in sort of regional innovation and innovation within the states? In fact, again, it just happened the night before you and I are having this conversation. The Republican primary debate, again, involved this squaring off between Gingrich and Ron Paul on the role of government in investing in certain kind of enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Or, as one might have well said, the Department of Agriculture in its agricultural stations virtually all over the country. So Ron Paul, of course, is a libertarian, so thinks we ought to, I guess, wipe all that away. And that was very much the debate that was going on in the first half of the 19th century, how when the Southern members of Congress did not want the federal government investing in roads and bridges and so forth. So, but in order to be competitive now, I think the United States government needs to engage more with targeting areas for development, areas of technology and science. There's a lot of talk about that right now. And I think that will happen in spite of the rhetoric that goes on. If it doesn't, we got a real problem. Now, the second, in particular, in the book is the fact that we are in what people have called the biological century. 19th century, sort of century of engineering, 20th century, century of physics. This is way too pat, but
no, there's a hell of a lot of truth to it.
It's roughly true. In biology now, we're seeing, as you well know, biology is merging, or converging is the word that people use in science policy, with physics and engineering and computing. And you cannot be a leading world power in the 21st century without being first-rate in biology and applied biology, what people often call biotechnology. Mm-hmm. So we are going to have to make that part of our science policy and our industrial policy. I mean, the two are actually converging also, science and industrial policy. We don't really have much of industrial policy right now. So, I think this is a big challenge we face. Singapore is building 4 biopolises, and everybody's freaking out about China. The EU says that China is going to surpass us in peer-reviewed science papers in 10 years.
It's already surpassed us in clean energy, so.
Exactly. And so, and yet, ironically, of course, we want, we kind of, the way the world economy is going, we need China to be doing well.
Yeah.
So this is a very complicated period, a novel period we're entering. The point is, the United States needs to be a player in applied science and technology, and I think we will be. But these debates, these cultural debates, don't help.
And in fact, this is my, and we've talked about this already, this is my somewhat, nagging point that I make about your thesis, is that these cultural debates keep preventing us from getting fully into the world where you postulate that we're going to have these sort of strange left-right allegiances to oppose new technologies, because frankly, we're still fighting all the time over abortion-related issues in the biomedical arena, like Plan B, like stem cells, and you're not getting to the ones where you might have sort of more tickling of the emotions of the green movement and making them get in a strange bedfellow allegiance with a more traditional conservative element.
Well, here's where my academic irony comes in, because yes, in many ways, if we were more like some parts of Western Europe, we would probably be in better shape.
And we'd also be like torching genetic crop fields, which we're not. So
right,
and banning nuclear power.
Well, precisely, and we'd, without mystifying it too much, we'd be losing what it is to be Americans to some extent. I mean, we do beat ourselves up about some issues that Europeans don't these days, and we are a traditional country, and that's some of the flavor of the country. So, I'm a liberal ironist in the sense that I think we have to accept the good with the bad. And push forward. So I don't have an algorithm that can solve this problem for us. I think it will gradually be resolved, and there'll be new problems. But somebody asked me the other day, well, what if we had never had Roe v. Wade? How would all this have been different? And I don't even know how to imagine a world like that. And for me, any statement that you make would be so counterfactual.
Yeah, counterfactual history. That doesn't get us very far.
It doesn't get us very far. So here's where we are. We're radically located. We have to deal with it. I do think, Chris, that it's possible to learn some things from our disputants. For example, the human dignity question. I think it is a mistake to take human dignity out of the progressive equation. I don't agree with people like Steve Pinker or my friend of longstanding, Ruth Macklin, the bioethicist, about this. I don't think ideas of human autonomy and self-determination substitute for human dignity. Virtually every international human rights document is founded on the admittedly airy but powerful notion of human dignity. I think the scientific method has advanced the idea of human equality and uniqueness and universal human rights, and we got to stick to that. And I don't think we should give it up.
Well, where's a case where you would see that playing out? Just to make it more concrete, what you mean by human dignity.
Well, I think when we worry about human rights campaigners in other countries and the ability to get on the web and express yourself as the way we are, that's what I mean.
Okay.
I saw, by the way, last night. You and I are both news junkies, right? So you'll forgive me.
Actually, I try to tune out of it.
Well, Christian Bale, who played Batman, of course, he got beat up trying to visit a human rights campaigner in Asia, and I was thinking, well, I was Batman. Why couldn't he just?
Yeah, I know. Like, he's pretty tough.
The crap out.
I wouldn't want to,
I wouldn't want to mess with him. Yeah, but I guess they didn't know he was Batman. He probably didn't have his cowl on, So anyway. So that's what I mean about human dignity.
Sure, okay.
And I think
no argument there.
And I think we give up something, and I think we have to appreciate that sometimes these polemical arguments, when we're the way that human dignity was pulled out during the embryonic stem cell debate, the peak of that era debate, these polemical arguments we have to realize are sometimes short term. We get carried away. There's some concepts we shouldn't jettison so easily.
Well, it was pulled out by the right more than the left. I'm sure that you would agree with me. It was.
Oh, absolutely. It was pulled out by the right. And the left said, well, screw it. We'll just give up human dignity. It's airy, and nobody knows what it really means.
Well, it was one of those multiple cases in which conservatives do a better job of appropriating the language, right? And it's
very true.
So, human dignity meant something that you wouldn't assume it to mean. We're not against human dignity, and they would say we are. And they're starting from the position of having owned the concept. Right.
Exactly, but we owned the concept in the 30s.
Yeah.
When the Okies were starving in the Dust Bowl, And there's some remarkable art, novels and film about that. And human dignity worked for the left.
What kind of innovations would you oppose, though, on human dignity grounds, if I can push you as a progressive? If we think about, where neuroscience may lead and basically understanding the brain's wiring and firing well enough that we can start really, putting some pills to work that'll mess with it in some way, for instance. I mean, is there some point at which the left, unlike the right, stands up and says, stop? Because that's sort of the right's job. It always has been.
I am more concerned these days about privacy issues, I think, than I am about the so-called enhancement issues. Mm-hmm. And I do think we have some, real worries. Everybody's on the grid. I mean, you and I are people who are, although separated by a part of a generation, are still very much on the grid. It's both an issue for government, but it's also an issue for industry. Back to the debates about a couple of months ago, I remember Ron Paul was complaining about government knowing what we're doing and worrying about drones in the sky, or, the kind of thing that Governor Perry proposed over the Texas border with Mexico. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that Paul was saying we really got to worry about government getting into our private lives, and he was standing in front of a set that said Google. Well, this is not only an issue for a government; it's also an issue for industry. So I would be more. I'm concerned about the ways the technology could undermine privacy. As I read somebody recently say, it's not enough to say, "Well, I have nothing to hide, so I don't care what they know." But there is something very important about privacy, and that our ability to presuppose that there are private spaces. And walking around Washington, that there are fewer and fewer truly private spaces. Yeah,
but the only defense against it is you figure, who's got enough time to actually bother and waste their time tracking me. But, if they do,
the new devices, facial biometrics is going to mean that fast computers can do it.
Yeah.
And will pull out data that a human operator will be able to look at. So I have some concerns about privacy, and I'm more worried about that, I have to say, than I am the enhancement issues.
And do you really feel that? I mean, here's where I think I'm gonna. I guess I'm not fully following you. You feel that in the future we really are going to have left-right allegiances against certain kinds of technologies in the United States?
I think we will, and I think actually privacy issues is one area where there could be an allegiance, and I think there will be.
Okay.
But I think the right is less likely, of course, to recognize that as a problem in the private sector. They're more likely to recognize it in the role of government as sort of the IRS.
Well, I just want to throw something at you. I've just finished a book. It's called The Republican Brain. It's already controversial, though it's not out yet. And in it, I kind of lay out the argument that there is an inherent psychological affinity. I don't want to preview it too much, but I want to bounce it off you because I think it might go in a different direction than you're. Inherent psychological affinity between liberals and scientists.
Yeah.
In that they have this whole, in being in love with nuance, ambiguity, uncertainty, either in love with them or at least comfortable with them. Which is what a lot of the scientific research suggests that this is one way in which liberals and conservatives are generally different, and liberals are more like the scientific community, plus being in love with the whole Enlightenment worldview that will make the world better and make us more equal and all the rest through knowledge. Why try to solve a problem if we don't know that it exists? There's so many other wonderful problems we could try to solve. And of course, the deepest rooting of this is the relationship with change. Liberals and science. Liberals are always more comfortable with change, and that's what's so hard to define what a liberal is. It changes every year. And scientists as the chief generators of change.
Yes.
Whereas conservatives generally being the resistors of all of this. To me, that seems like, I know that dynamic is going to play out in radically different ways because of cultural differences. Okay, you play this dynamic out in a totalitarian communist regime, and it looks really, really different. But the essences seem to be rooted in psychology. So in that sense, it seems to me that the left is always going to be the one embracing the myth. I mean, there might be some cases where it's not so anymore, but it's much more likely to be so.
I think that's. Well, I'm going to defer to the psychologist now. John Haidt is a buddy, and
he would be familiar with this. Although he does it more about the moral differences within liberals and conservatives, rather than they're all psychological sometimes, rather than the personality.
I think he's a personality psychologist. He's an expert in moral development. And he's done a lot of social psychological studies. He also has a book coming out next year. I'm sure you're aware, called The Righteous Mind, which I think will get a lot of attention. So I'm going to defer to the psychologists on this score. But I think that the change argument is a little tricky if you think about the history of progressivism, because I think part of what was going on in the late 19th, early 20th centuries and the first real progressive movements was a reaction to some of the changes that were happening in the country, particularly, of course, the collection of large amounts of money because of the Industrial Revolution in a few pockets, the malefactors of great wealth, TR's famous phrase, and those were changes that the progressives were very unhappy about.
Right. Well, yeah. I guess I'll put a little end note here. I mean, so Ronald Reagan caused change. George W. Bush caused change. I mean, it wasn't progressive change. Certainly not every single kind of change. Conservatives will often want change to go back.
Yeah.
So, and I guess progressives could resist change that seems retrograde. So.
Yeah. So obviously the definitions have to be made very carefully. On the other hand, what is consistent from the early 20th century progressives to modern progressives is a belief in technological change as improving human flourishing. So Roosevelt was also very involved in rural electrification, which, although we now, of course, take all this for granted, except when the power goes out, the conditions of rural Americans were really grim in the late 19th century. They hadn't changed much in 100 years in many places. And Roosevelt, saw that there had to be an aggressive movement in that direction to bring those people into the society. So, in that sense, I think we share with these earlier progressive movement a century ago a sense that technological change is a good thing. That also, of course, was resisted. But sort of interesting in the book I mentioned that people were also worried about cars because the internal combustion engine created the possibility for young people to go off and have sex in their cars. This was actually a worry 100 and some odd years ago. Yeah, terrifying. And of course, they were right. But somehow we've survived that. And on the whole, I think we're probably better off for having some independently operating vehicles, though we do need to change the energy source.
This is actually not just related to Jonathan Haidt's work, but this is also a Lakoffian idea.
Yes.
In his argument, this is why liberals mess up so much, is because they're so wedded to scientific and evidence-based types of discourses that they don't understand that most of the world doesn't operate based upon the logical kinds of premises that they think everyone should be operating.
But this is also another reason that I think we need to embrace dignity. Human dignity has been enhanced on the whole by science and technology. You don't have to be much of a reader. We're getting into the holiday season now, where people are going to be recalling Scrooge and the Dickensian lives of people in mid-19th century London. And how lives have been improved and human dignity has been improved so vastly in the last 150 years by science and technology. Of course, we're completely inured to that until we remember what life was like before. So there was nothing particularly dignified about London in the middle of the 19th century for about 95% of the people who lived there. It was a pretty unpleasant life. So, again, I think in the spirit of Lakoff, I would say let's embrace what technology and science have done for human dignity in only a blink of an eye over 200,000 years of modern human appearance on the planet.
I think that there's something very powerful here. If we could just do a better job of capturing the force of the narrative that you begin with, which is that this is the Enlightenment country. This is the country that was founded, in my terminology, by the people who embraced science and change.
Yeah,
and maybe not as extreme as the French did, but that was who they were. And there's something very heroic and inspiring about that narrative, which is only, I think, known generally to people like you, me, the scientific community, etc. You don't hear enough. It's at least it's not powerful enough used to counter the conservative narrative. This is a Christian country. This is the country of people who didn't want a big government.
Yeah. Well, and I, as you know, worked at the University of Virginia for 8 years, and was always struck when I went up to Monticello. Of course, that on the one hand you had this this brilliant guy who really wanted, like several of his contemporaries, Franklin and Hamilton and Washington and others, to peer over into the future. And so he represented, people loved to see Jefferson's toys, like the office chair on casters.
Or the Jefferson Bible. Rick Perlstein, the historian, was telling me about this. I want to make sure I get it right. Jefferson went through the Bible, and he edited it with,
that's right,
I think, a razor. And he took out, again, we've got Wikipedia this, but
the implausible
parts. He took out miracles, I think. He
exactly.
And pasted it back in again. I mean, this would be just horrific to...
and he was accused of being, we would today call a secular humanist, which he probably was. And he had, of course,
I think it's really cool to do that, but, it's just...
Yeah, well, it's fascinating it's just from a historical point of view, what an interesting character. But on the other hand, when I went up there, I also was always reminded of the battle between the two Jefferson families, the white family and the black family, and the resistance to accepting that, the scientific evidence, 99-point-something accuracy, that Sally Hemings was, in fact, the mother of some of his children. Or grandmother, great-great-great-great-grandmother. So, there in itself is the conflict. And yet, as I said, it gives flavor to the country. It is part of what sets us apart, for good or ill. We just have to fight our way through it.
Well, so here I think maybe let's just push towards a conclusion. We started with Plan B, then we toured American history, and then we looked at the future. Do we... And I want to make the conclusion, if I can, about the Obama administration. The president comes in, gives this rousing speech, we'll restore science to its rightful place in America. And coming off the Bush administration, which I and so many others excoriated for abusing science. And let's face it, the political right today that wants to unseat Obama is still, much more at war with knowledge than he is. They reject climate science outright, for instance. But looking back on it, 3 years later, almost 4, the science community isn't as happy as they hoped that they would be.
That's true.
With Obama. What do you make of that? A progressive governing today, supposedly in love with science, but honestly, when they get in, they can't necessarily deliver. And was our typically liberal progressive optimism too irrationally rational? So
I have not had time to talk to a lot of people in the science policy world about Plan B. I'm not sure that the science policy people are as upset about Plan B because as some of the reproductive rights folks that I know.
Oh, I don't know. They ought to be. This was Exhibit A against George W. Bush.
Well, maybe they should be. I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I'm just saying I don't think they're focusing on it particularly. Frankly, the worry that people have now in places like the University of Pennsylvania, the big research institutions, is the fact that The budgets for science are flat. And ironically, while the Bush administration was so horrible, rhetorically, and actually did get in the way, as you show in your book, of policy statements with respect to some science, that was also the period in which the NIH was doubling its budget.
No, because there was much more money.
There was more money.
It was a party, yeah. It was great.
There was more money. Frankly, right now, as compared to 7 years ago when I would go to science meetings and people would be furious at the Bush administration for their position on stem cells, even if they weren't stem cell biologists, by the way. But on the other hand, now the atmosphere is one in which people are really worried about how they're going to continue to do their work. So you may well be right that they ought to be more worried about this scientific integrity business than they with respect to Plan B. But I think most scientists are saying, well, let's try to get through the budget year. Plan B doesn't really affect us that much. We're trying to keep our postdocs in the lab.
Well, that would be shifting to a very different set of issues.
Yeah, well, I think everybody's affected by what's going on at the time. And we worried about Islamofascism and stem cells and kind of saw it, in some of the same light 5 or 6 years ago. Things are changing now. But I think the scientific integrity issue will come back in what I hope will be a second Obama administration. And I think probably the Plan B issue will be revisited. Mm-hmm. There is now a legal case pending, as you know, challenge to the administration on overruling the FDA. That'll take a long time to sort out, I guess. So it's not done yet. But as you and I started the conversation, we do have to protect science from its friends, as much, if not more so, than its enemies.
Sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, Jonathan, it's been great to go with you on this tour of the history of science in America and the future of science in America. It's always great to talk to you.
Well, it's good of you to do it. I really enjoyed it, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So long.
And good luck with your book.
Bye.
Bye.